It's the May of remembrance. Remembrance of one of the most important days of their Jewish history. And that was the day in which Moses brought his people out of the land of Egypt and started them in their journey towards the promised land. And that was the night that the lamb was slain, as a premonition of Jesus being slain tomorrow on Good Friday for our sake and for our salvation. And just as Moses led the people out of Egypt, Jesus leads us out of the death of sin, and he leads us into salvation. So the Passover is a very special time, and Jesus goes to celebrate his last Passover. And he tells the apostles, go get a room all set up, get the Seder supper ready, and we will meet you in the evening. And when evening came, Jesus goes to the room where it's all been set up, the dinner's ready, and he goes and sits at the table. And during the meal, he takes a loaf of bread and he breaks it and he passes it out to his apostles. And he said, this is my body. And then he took the cup and filled with wine and he gave it to his disciples and apostles and said, this is my blood. Little did they know what that meant. But at that moment, what Jesus was giving to us was the Eucharist. Because tomorrow, that bread and that wine will become his body and his blood. And that will be the remembrance we have of him dying for us and giving his all for our salvation. As he gets finished the supper, he begins his last discourse. And he tells the apostles all that he wants to tell them now about his Father's will and what they are to do to follow him. Because they have no idea what's going to happen tonight. They have no idea that in a few hours, Jesus would no longer be with them in the way they have known him. In a few hours, Jesus will be crucified. But the apostles listen to what he has to say, and he talks to them about being the mystical body of Christ. Talks to them about being part of the vine, and they are the branches in that vine. And if they don't stay close to that vine, they'll die and shrivel up. Yes, we're all members of the mystical body. We're all members of that vine, and Jesus is that vine. He is the source of our life. He talks about his Father's will and what he have come to do, that he has spent these 3 years doing what his Father wanted. Oh yes, he could have done his own will, but he always chose to do the will of his Father. And after the meal was over, Jesus goes to the feet of the apostles and he starts to wash their feet. And Peter gets excited and says, you can't wash my feet, Jesus. That's a job for a slave or a servant or a maid. But Jesus turned and said, I have not come here to be served, but I have come here to serve, and so will you. And so he appoints them as his first priests. After the meal is over, he goes out into the garden, and he takes 3 of his apostles with him, Peter, James, and John. And he tells them to wait there as he went by a rock and started to pray. And as he prayed, he says, Father, Father, if it's your will, please let this chalice pass from me. And he continues to pray. He goes back to his apostles. He finds his apostles asleep. They didn't have a clue of what was going on. He tells them to watch some more. And he goes back and he prays again to his Father. Father, please let this chalice pass from me. But again, it's not my will. I don't ever want to do my will. I just want to do yours. But please let this pass from me. And he goes back to the apostles a second time. And again, they're asleep, having no clue. And the third time, he goes back to the rock and he finally prays once more time. Jesus prays to his Father and asks for salvation from this terrible, terrible incident. And in the background, he hears noise. He hears the temple police coming with a mob. And they come and they take him And they tie his hands around his back, and they drag him with the rope to the high priest. And that night, they gather together before the high priest, and they bring forth witnesses who are willing to lie and say things that Jesus was never guilty of. But the priests want to buy that because Jesus is a threat to them. And so they know they can't condemn him to death because there's no rule that says they could do this in the Torah. And of course, they have to follow their rules. And so they say they will bring him to Pilate in the morning and let him condemn him. Meanwhile, out in the garden, there's Peter, hiding, afraid to be taken and have the same fate for him because he followed Jesus. And a man comes along and sees Jesus by the fire, and you were one of them. And Peter says, no, I'm not one of them. I do not know him. I do not even know that man. And a little while later, someone else comes along and says, you were one of them. I saw you with them. You used to be with him. You used to go with him when he went on his mission. Yes, you were one of them. And Peter again says, no, I don't know the man. And then the servant comes and says to him, you certainly were one of them because you talk like a Galilean and he was a Galilean, so you definitely must be one of him. Peter then realizes that he's just betrayed his best friend. He goes away crying and weeping.